Welcome back to the deep dive. We're going to be diving into something pretty big today
Yeah.
that could have a big impact on your investments, and that is the U.S. presidential election.
Huge.
Yeah, Trump just won, and we're here to kind of help you figure out
Right.
what that could mean for you,
Yeah.
especially if you're a Malaysian investor.
Yeah, that's right. And we're not just speculating. We have a recent interview with Trump
Oh, wow.
from just 3 weeks ago.
Oh, very recent.
Very recent, yeah, where he lays out his economic vision pretty clearly.
Exactly. It's like we have a time machine, you know,
Yeah.
letting us peek into his thinking right before the election.
Right.
Plus, we'll be looking at an analysis outlining the potential ripple effects on Malaysia's economy.
Exactly.
It's like having a sneak peek into the future of your portfolio.
This isn't about like crystal balls or anything. This is about understanding what Trump has said he wants to do.
Right.
And then analyzing what that could mean for Malaysian investors like you.
All right, so let's get started with trade relations.
Okay.
One thing that really jumps out from this interview is Trump's love for tariffs.
Oh, yeah.
He even calls them beautiful.
Yeah, he does. He sees tariffs as the key to protecting American companies and bringing jobs back to the U.S.
And he's not just talking theory.
Right.
He gives specific examples. He claims that because of his tariff threats, some auto plants planned for Mexico were scrapped, and John Deere scaled back plans for plants outside the U.S.
Right. He's trying to show that he's serious about using tariffs
Yeah.
to change the behavior of companies both American and foreign.
Okay, so that's what happened in the U.S., but what does it mean for Malaysian businesses?
Well, it could be a double-edged sword.
Uh-oh.
On one hand, if you're a Malaysian business exporting to the U.S., you might face some difficulties, especially if you're in sectors like electronics, palm oil, or rubber.
Right.
Those are big exports for Malaysia.
Yeah.
And they could be vulnerable to new tariffs under a Trump administration.
That sounds like a potential downside for sure.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a double-edged sword. Is there an upside here too?
There could be. Remember, Trump wants to reduce U.S. reliance on China.
Right.
He's talked about shifting supply chains away from China. This could create opportunities for Malaysian firms
Okay.
to step in as alternative suppliers for U.S. companies.
So Malaysian businesses need to be ready to adapt.
Oh, exactly. This is where staying informed becomes really important.
Yeah.
You need to know which sectors are most likely to be impacted,
Okay.
both positively and negatively.
Okay, let's move on to the broader economic impact.
Right.
The analysis suggests that Trump's policies, especially his stance on trade and interest rates, could create a lot of uncertainty in the markets.
That's right. And uncertainty is something that markets generally don't like. It often leads to volatility.
Yeah.
We could see fluctuations in currency markets, for example, which would directly impact the Malaysian ringgit.
So Malaysian investors need to brace themselves for some potential turbulence.
In a sense, yes, understanding and managing currency risk will be really important in this new environment.
Let's zoom in on the Malaysian ringgit specifically. The analysis suggests that if Trump implements protectionist policies, it could reduce demand for Malaysian goods, which could put downward pressure on the ringgit.
Yes, that's a key takeaway. A weaker ringgit could have both pros and cons.
Okay.
If you're a Malaysian exporter, a weaker ringgit can make your products more competitive on the global market.
Right.
But on the flip side, it also makes imported goods more expensive for Malaysian consumers, which can contribute to inflation.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. It all depends on your specific circumstances and how you adapt to these potential changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Now let's move on to something a bit more traditional: gold. It's often seen as a safe haven asset during times of uncertainty.
Right.
So could gold be a good investment for Malaysians in a Trump presidency?
It's definitely worth considering. Remember, Trump's policies could spark fears of inflation, and that often drives up gold prices.
Okay.
If you're looking to hedge against potential market volatility,
Right.
gold could be a good option.
So maybe it's time for Malaysian investors to add a little bit of sparkle to their portfolios.
Potentially, yes. It's certainly a market worth watching closely, especially given the uncertainty surrounding Trump's policies.
Okay, let's move on to our final topic for today. Crude palm oil, or CPO. It's a major export for Malaysia. Could Trump's policies impact CPO prices?
Yes, that's a valid concern. In the interview, Trump talked about imposing tariffs on goods from China.
Right.
Now, he didn't mention palm oil specifically, but it's a key export for Malaysia.
Right.
And it's possible it could get caught in the crossfire of a trade war.
So another potential risk for Malaysian investors to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And this is where diversification becomes really important if you're heavily invested in CPO. It might be wise to explore diversifying your investments perhaps into other commodities or sectors less likely to be affected by U.S. trade policy.
That's a great point. It's like the old saying, Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Diversification is a key principle of smart investing, especially when you're facing a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the potential impacts of Trump's policies on trade relations, currency fluctuations, the price of gold, the Malaysian ringgit, and even the implications for the palm oil industry. That's a lot to process.
It is, but remember, this interview is from 3 weeks ago before the election. Now that he's won, we have to see how he actually implements these ideas.
So this is just the beginning of the story,
Yeah.
right? We've gotten a glimpse into his thinking, but now we have to wait and see how things play out in the real world.
Exactly. And that's why staying informed is so important. You need to keep up with developments in U.S. policy, understand how those policies are likely to impact Malaysia, and adjust your investment strategy accordingly.
So it's not about panicking. It's about being informed and prepared.
Exactly. The more you understand about the global economic landscape, the better equipped you'll be to make smart decisions for your investments.
All right, now I want to go back to something Trump said in this interview that I found really striking. He seems really fixated on the idea of the U.S. losing its status as the world's reserve currency. He even compares it to losing a war.
Yes, that's a powerful statement, and it reveals a lot about his mindset. He sees economics as a zero-sum game, where if one country wins, another has to lose. He's determined to make sure the U.S. remains on top.
He even talks about using tariffs as a weapon to force other countries to continue using the U.S. dollar.
Right, and that's a risky strategy. Trying to coerce other countries into using a dollar could backfire. It might actually accelerate the move away from the dollar if those countries see it as a form of economic bullying.
So it's a delicate balancing act.
Absolutely, and this raises a crucial question for Malaysian investors. What will happen to the U.S. dollar under a Trump presidency? Will he be able to maintain its dominance, or will his policies inadvertently weaken it? And what would that mean for the Malaysian ringgit?
Those are important questions, and it highlights how interconnected the global economy is. What happens in the U.S. can have ripple effects all over the world, including in Malaysia.
Exactly, and that's why it's so crucial for Malaysian investors to have a global perspective. You can't just focus on what's happening in Malaysia. You need to understand the bigger picture and how global events could impact your investments.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another topic that came up in the interview: immigration. Trump has been very vocal about his desire to drastically reduce immigration, both legal and illegal. He paints a very negative picture of immigrants claiming they're criminals and a drain on society.
Yes, and that rhetoric is concerning on several levels. First, it's simply not true. Immigrants play a vital role in many economies, including the U.S. They contribute to the workforce, they start businesses, they bring new ideas and skills.
But Trump seems to see immigration as a threat rather than an asset.
That's right, and that perspective could have negative consequences for businesses that rely on immigrant labor, which could ultimately impact the U.S. economy.
So how could this impact Malaysia?
Well, it's difficult to say for sure, but it's worth remembering that Malaysia also relies on immigrant labor, particularly in sectors like manufacturing and agriculture. If the U.S. makes it more difficult for people to immigrate, it could potentially create a larger pool of available labor for Malaysia.
So it's possible that Malaysia could benefit from Trump's anti-immigration policies, even if those policies end up hurting the U.S. economy.
It's a possibility worth considering. It's all part of understanding the complex interplay of global economic forces.
Okay, let's move on to our final topic for today: technology in the interview. Trump expresses some pretty strong opinions about Google. He claims they're biased against him and that they have too much power.
Yes, and this fits into a broader pattern for Trump. He often sees himself as a victim of powerful forces, whether it's the media, the tech industry, or what he calls the deep state.
He even suggests that the Justice Department should break up Google.
Which is a pretty radical proposal. Breaking up a company of that size and influence would have massive ramifications for the tech sector and for the economy as a whole.
It's hard to even imagine what the consequences would be.
It would certainly create a lot of disruption and uncertainty, and it's not clear whether it would actually achieve the goals Trump claims to be aiming for.
So a lot of unknowns there, but one thing that I guess clear is that Trump is not afraid to use the power of the government to go after companies he perceives as enemies.
Yes, and that's something that businesses both large and small need to be aware of.
You never know who might be in his crosshairs next. Okay, before we move on to our final thoughts for today, I want to touch on one more thing that struck me from this interview: Trump's seeming obsession with age.
You're right, it was a recurring theme. He talked about appointing young judges. He bragged about how young his Supreme Court picks were. He even suggested that people should start taking cognitive tests in their 40s.
Yeah, and this was just weeks before the election where he'd be running against Joe Biden, who's actually 4 years older than him. It almost seemed like he was trying to preemptively defend himself against accusations that he's too old for the job.
It's possible. It was certainly interesting to hear him talk about age so much, especially in that context.
But here's the thing that really stood out to me later in the interview. He completely contradicts himself. He says he'd have no problem appointing a CEO who's 78.
Yes, it just goes to show that he often says whatever he thinks will benefit him in the moment, regardless of consistency or logic. It can be difficult to know which statements to take seriously.
That's true, and it makes it even more challenging to predict what he'll actually do once he's in office.
Exactly. It's going to be a fascinating 4 years, that's for sure.
It does feel like we're stepping into uncharted territory here. But even with all this uncertainty, we need to figure out what it means for Malaysian investors like you. What should they be doing right now based on what we've learned from this interview with Trump?
Well, you're absolutely right. Let's try and distill all of this into some actionable advice.
Okay.
First and foremost, diversification is key.
Okay.
This isn't new advice, but it's even more important now. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Spread your investments across different asset classes, industries, and even countries.
So don't just focus on the Malaysian market.
Exactly. Think globally. Consider investing in markets that might be less affected by Trump's policies or even markets that might benefit from them.
That's a great point. It's all about managing risk and finding opportunities wherever they may exist. What else should Malaysian investors be doing?
Stay informed. Don't just rely on headlines or social media.
Right.
Dig deeper. Read analysis from reputable sources and try to understand the nuances of Trump's policies and how they're likely to be implemented.
So knowledge is power.
Absolutely. The more you understand, the better equipped you'll be to make smart decisions. And remember, this interview is from 3 weeks ago.
Right.
Things have changed since then.
Yeah.
Trump has won the election. Now we need to see how his words translate into action. Pay close attention to the actual policies he puts in place, not just his campaign promises.
So don't just assume that everything he said in this interview will come to pass.
Exactly. There's often a big difference between campaign rhetoric and reality.
Right.
And finally, be prepared for some volatility in the markets.
Yo.
Uncertainty makes investors nervous, and that can lead to some choppy waters.
So buckle up. It could be a bumpy ride.
Yeah. Yes, but remember, volatility can also create opportunities. If you're prepared, you can navigate those turbulent waters and potentially come out ahead.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's potential for both risk and reward.
That's exactly right. And that brings us to our final thought for today.
Okay.
Trump has talked about being tougher on allies than enemies when it comes to trade. How will that impact Malaysia as being an ally? Going to be an advantage or a disadvantage in this new landscape?
That's a great question, and it's something that Malaysian investors need to think about carefully. The relationship between the U.S. and Malaysia is complex, and it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves under a Trump presidency.
It certainly will be, and it highlights the importance of taking a long-term perspective. Don't just focus on the short-term noise. Think about the bigger picture, the long-term trends, and how they might affect your investments.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay calm.
Great advice.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and insightful. We'll see you next time.